Hello, fellow knitters. Valerie here with some tips and tricks for you as we set out on our Florida road trip. Tip number 1. You have to decide this year if you're going to follow the main route or the alternate route. When you make this decision, you're deciding for the first 6 legs, so think it through carefully. On the main route, you are going to knit both Cynthia's design and my design for each of the first 6 legs, and they will get stacked one on top of the other like so. If you opt for the alternate route, you will choose to knit either Cynthia's design or my design, and they will be done 2 times. Whichever one you decide to do, you'll do it 2 times, one on each edging, so they'll be separated. Okay, so main route, you knit both designs, one on top of the other. Alternate route, you pick one design and knit it twice, once on each edging that you have made. Okay, so that's choice number 1 and tip number 1. Always make sure, if you're doing the alternate route, always make sure to go to the very last page of the instructions to see if there are any special things you have to consider as you're following the alternate route. Okay? Tip number 2. Got a swatch here. In our swatch, it switches colors. We're going to do that a fair amount in this shawl. And we have a beautiful seed stitch edge on each side because we don't want curling, right? Nothing worse than a shawl that curls when you don't want it to. And so that seed stitch is really pretty, but it's a little tricky when you change colors. If you just go with the knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl type thing on the very first row, you get kind of this funny little bumble stuff. We avoid that and get a nice clean line like so by just knitting that first row. So even though it's in the seed stitch edge section, the first row of any color change, we're going to knit straight rather than doing the knit, purl. And you really can't tell in the seed stitch edge that there's a difference, but you can tell with that funny little purl bumps basically kind of get in the way with the color change. So that's tip 2. Always make sure you're knitting the first row of the seed stitch edge after a color change. And we do note that in the pattern. I just wanted to emphasize it. Here's another tip about that edge. When you're changing color, the very first stitch of every row is slipped. So when you're changing colors, you've got this tail from the previous color, and when you slip that stitch, you want to move that tail to the back to get it out of the way. And then you can join your new yarn and knit away. So the first row is always going to look a little funny because you're going to have one stitch in the old color. That's the stitch that was slipped. Okay, so you'll have one stitch in the old color and then you'll have your new color for the rest of the row. All right. Tip number 3. Because we're doing both lace and texture patterns, and we have some garter stitch, we have a lot of variety of things, and all those things tend to have different gauge. We make note of what needles to use. So when you did your gauge swatch, you should have figured out the size of your larger needles, okay? And then just get a size of needles one size down that will be considered your smaller needles. In the pattern, under the headings for the chart or the written instructions, you'll always see an instruction that tells you what yarn to use and which needles to use. So pay attention to that and make sure that you are switching back and forth so that your shawl ends up being shaped pretty pretty straight. It'll still pull in quite a bit while you have, well, that's just the nature of lace. But we try and accommodate that. All right, the other thing I wanted to show you, going back to the diagram, you can see we have our start your engines clue, and then we have leg 1 part A, leg 1 part B, okay, and those are interchangeable. Cynthia's and mine, you can do them in whatever order. But see these nice little pink stripes? These are what we call a beaded divider. And you want to make sure that you always do a beaded divider after every design panel, so lace or texture. And when you do your beaded divider, we have this little chart that'll help you remember, oh, do I have to do it again or not? So those are my tips and tricks. You want to make sure you know which route you're taking. You want to make sure you always knit the first row of a new color. And you want to always make sure you know which needles you're using. And the best tip of all, have fun. Enjoy!